Professor Mark Kayser, what were your first thoughts on the outcome of the European elections?
Well, I think my first thoughts, as the thoughts of many people, were simply shock at the success of the right. We saw it in a lot of polling, but there's a difference between polling and seeing it in reality. And the outcomes, not just in the fringes of Europe, not just in the fringes of society, but the outcome actually inside very important, indispensable countries central to the European enterprise, such as France, and seeing that it was not only fringe voters, but it was voters across the board and geographically distributed across almost all of France who chose the National Front as the plurality party. That was indeed shocking.
Okay, so what do you then think are the most influential factors for Europeans when they decide who to vote for in the elections?
Well, there's always a difference between national elections and what you could call second-order elections, such as the recent European elections. In general, for this election, right, many of the voters didn't know very much about European policy per se, or differences even between groups, party groups within the European Parliament. So this was not a policy-focused type of election. This was an election in which people voted very much in certain countries, like in Spain. I was in Spain shortly before the election, and there was no attention whatsoever to European issues. People knew an election was coming, but all they saw simply was all of these posters about vote for this party or that party based on national issues. They didn't even cover any European debates on the public media in Spain. And so to interpret it, you have to go country by country. Certain other countries really did look much more at policy and the European issues, but they were really much more of a minority. The economy mattered to the results, certainly in countries that have seen economic contractions and austerity. If you look at the more than 20% contraction of GDP in some countries in the South, like Greece, it's understandable to see that extremist parties on the extreme left and on the extreme right did extremely well. Golden Dawn came in ahead, right, had a greater part of the vote, a greater share of the vote, than PASOK, which is deeply shocking. But the economy certainly mattered there. In Spain, the two largest parties lost vote share. The economy mattered there. But there's other countries that have been quite successful economically, in which you saw also a rise in the anti-European parties. Sweden is a notable example, right? How do you use the economy to explain the rise in the extreme right up to 9.8% for the Sweden Democrats in Sweden? That's much more difficult. So you have to add on, in explaining the results, a lot of issues about discontent with Europe itself. And this is reading into it. We don't have any surveys based on this. We don't have any elaborate research at this point. So a lot of this is simply speculation, but informed speculation, that voters were expressing their lack of agreement or their lack of contentedness with the way that Europe is run. And there's a sense of a democratic deficit and a sense of a lack of accountability that is a very likely source of some of these protest votes.
And do you think the low turnout in some of the member states should they be interpreted as anti-votes or as simply a lack of interest?
Yeah, there's a lot of attention to what happened with turnout levels in the upper teens only in Slovakia as being the most extreme example. And it's tough to say. You've seen other polls in Eastern Europe that Eastern Europeans are often much more content than Western Europeans with the European Union. So one could even interpret those, the very extreme, abominable, really low levels of turnout in Slovakia and some other Eastern European countries. Maybe it's just contentedness, right? Or just unawareness. So it's very difficult to attribute or to attach a direct explanation to a lot of this. Overall, what you see compared to 2009, right, was a very, very marginal, very slight uptick, 1/10 of 1 percentage point in turnout. Some people, if you're, a glass half full type, you would look at that and say, well, this is the first time that we didn't see a decline in turnout. And so we could interpret that as a stable result in terms of turnout, at least as progress. On the other side, you could say, well, at some point it had to bottom out anyhow, right? Turnout is only going to go so low. It's difficult to go below, the 40s, you'd say, unless people who have a habit of voting or socialized to vote deviate from their normal behavior. And so it had to bottom out at some point. It might just be that we bottomed out and there really is an explanation.
Thank you very much.